The candles in the Pembroke Ballroom burned in clusters of 12, and the light they cast was gold enough to make even a plain gown look deliberate. Eliza Hartley's gown was not plain by intention. It had been her mother's once, the silk a pale blue that had faded to something closer to gray, the hem retrimmed 3 times with whatever ribbon the drapers on Sackville Street would sell for pennies. She had pressed it herself that afternoon, kneeling on the floor of the rented room in Marylebone with a cloth and a flat iron she had borrowed from the landlady, working each fold flat while Gerald sat at the window and pretended not to watch. She stood now at the edge of the ballroom's east wall, between a potted orange tree and a marble pillar, and she held her program so tightly that the card had begun to bend. Every line on it was empty. The season of 1814 was 3 weeks old, and in those 3 weeks Eliza Hartley had attended 2 assemblies, 1 private card party, and this ball, and she had danced at none of them. She had been introduced to 4 gentlemen. 2 had bowed and turned away. 1 had asked her father's name, heard the answer, and found urgent business elsewhere. The 4th had not asked her name at all. She did not count the empty lines. She had stopped counting things that would not change. What she did not yet know, standing between the orange tree and the pillar with her bent program in her hand, was that James Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, had already looked at her twice. The Pembroke Ballroom held perhaps 200 people on a good evening. Lady Dorothea Pembroke, widow of the late Earl and the Duke of Ashford's maternal aunt, had ensured this evening qualified. The room was laid with beeswax candles rather than tallow. The orchestra had been engaged from a firm on the Strand, rather than the usual county musicians. And the champagne was French. Dorothea had positioned herself at the head of the room in a chair that was not quite a throne, her fan held at precisely the height that established she was resting and not receiving, and she had arranged Miss Cecily Vane at her right hand like a document awaiting signature. Cecily Vane was 20 years old, the daughter of a baronet with a Hertfordshire estate and no entailments, and she wore a gown the color of cream that had not been retrimmed at all, because it had no need of trimming. She smiled at the correct moments and turned her head with a practiced elegance that suggested she had rehearsed against a looking-glass, which she had. She was not unkind, exactly. She had simply been told her entire life that she was the correct choice, and she had seen no evidence to contradict this. Eliza saw her from across the room and felt nothing in particular except a small, tired recognition, the way one recognizes weather through a window. She turned her gaze back to the orchestra. Her program fell. It slipped from her hand in a single smooth motion, sliding between her fingers and landing face down on the ballroom floor 3 feet from the nearest couple, who stepped around it without looking down. She moved to retrieve it herself, but a hand reached it first. The hand wore a white glove. The glove fit so perfectly that she could see the architecture of the knuckles beneath it. She looked up. James Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, was taller than she had understood a person to be. He was perhaps 35 years old, dark-haired, and built with the particular stillness of a man who had learned very young that rooms paid attention to him and had decided, in response, to give them nothing to read. His face was not unkind. It was composed the way a sealed letter is composed, complete and correct, and giving away nothing of its contents. His eyes were the color of smoke over autumn water, and they were looking directly at her. He turned the program over, glanced at it, and held it out. "Miss Hartley," he said. She had not told him her name. He had found it somewhere, in the preceding moment, or the one before that, and she did not know what to do with that information, except take the program and say thank you. She said thank you. He inclined his head. He did not walk away. "You are not dancing," he said. It was not a question. It was a statement issued from a great height, the way one might note that a window was unlatched. "No," she said. "Not this set." He looked at the program in her hand. He did not ask to see it again. He knew what he had already seen. "The next set," he said, "will be a country dance." She waited for him to continue. He did not continue. He stood there in the candlelight and looked at her, the way one looks at something one is deciding whether to name, and she felt her heartbeat move to her throat, which she resented because she had worked very hard to stop feeling things that would not be reciprocated. "Your Grace," said a voice behind her, warm and precise as a dropped pin. "I believe Cecily requires a word." It was Lady Dorothea Pembroke, appearing at his shoulder with the unerring spatial instinct of a woman who had navigated these rooms for 40 years. She did not look at Eliza. She looked at him. He turned his head toward his aunt. He said, "Then she may have one," and walked with Dorothea toward the head of the room, and Eliza was left holding her program in the candlelight, with 3 empty lines and no way to understand what had just occurred. The young woman beside her, a rector's daughter named Miss Porter, who had been her only companion at these events, appeared at her elbow. "Was that the Duke of Ashford?" she whispered. "He retrieved my program," Eliza said. "That is all." It was not all, but she did not know that yet. She was 22 years old. Her father, Edward Hartley, had died 9 months ago in November, of a fever that had taken him inside a fortnight, before the debts he had quietly accumulated over 7 years could be addressed or explained. The debts were not monstrous. They were merely ruinous at their scale, the way a single broken axle can strand a carriage in the middle of a crossing. £400 owed to the firm of Sims and Alderton, solicitors, representing a compound of unpaid loans that had consolidated, with interest, into a sum that Edward had believed he would resolve by the following quarter, and had not. He had died without telling Gerald, who was 19 years old, and who had inherited the debt along with their father's name, and a pair of good boots and nothing else. Eliza had found the letters from Mr. Sims in a locked box in her father's study 3 days after the funeral. She had sat on the floor of the study and read them twice. Gerald had not found them because Gerald had been at Oxford, finishing a term he would not be able to afford to complete, and because Eliza had a habit of looking at things carefully and thoroughly before deciding how to speak about them. She had been looking at this problem for 9 months. The season was her only available answer. Not for herself, because she had no illusions about what a rector's daughter adjacent income and a faded blue gown would produce in the marriage market. She had come to London on the specific calculation that there were charitable funds attached to certain livings, that Gerald was genuinely clever and might be introduced to someone who could use cleverness, and that Mr. Sims had made a quiet approach to her in February suggesting that the £400 might be managed, reduced even, if she would be willing to sign certain documents attesting to matters she had not witnessed. She had not signed the documents. She had written back to Mr. Sims very politely and told him she would require more time to consider. More time meant the season. The season meant this ballroom, and this orange tree, and this bent program with its empty lines, and a hand in a white glove that had reached for it before she could. If the story you are hearing feels familiar, it is because it is old, and because the women who have lived it rarely appear in the books afterward. If you are finding it recognizable, stay a moment longer. The rest of this evening has not yet happened. The next fortnight passed in the way that early season fortnights pass for women without invitations, which is to say slowly and with great attention to small details. Eliza observed things. She observed that the Duke of Ashford attended 3 events in those 2 weeks, and that he danced at none of them, which struck her as notable in a man who had presumably been introduced to dancing at some point in his 35 years. She observed that he spoke to perhaps 4 people at each event, and that 2 of those 4 were consistently his aunt, and a man she later identified as his secretary, whose name was Holt, and who carried a leather document case at all times. She observed that whenever Ashford was in the same room as Eliza Hartley, he was aware of it. She did not observe the last thing consciously. She recorded it as a series of separate, coincidental facts: that he had been standing near the east window when she entered the Covent Garden card party, that he had turned slightly when she crossed the room, that he had asked Holt something in a low voice immediately after she spoke to Miss Porter. Each fact was a pebble, and she placed each one carefully in a separate pile, because she had learned that piles grow into structures only if you allow them to, and she would not allow this one. Her caution was not without cost. She noticed his hands. She noticed the way he stood, not at ease exactly, but settled. The way a stone that has been placed precisely is settled. She noticed that his jaw held a tension that was not anger, but something older, a sustained containment that looked like cold indifference, until one studied it from an angle and understood it for what it was. The posture of a person who had learned to hold a very specific grief very close to the surface, where it could not be expressed and could not be forgotten. She did not know what the grief was. She did not ask. She had no occasion to ask. And the thought that she might was a pebble she placed in the pile she would not allow to become a structure. In the second week of the season, Mr. Sims arrived at Marylebone. He came in the afternoon, while Gerald was out, and he sat in the landlady's parlor and laid his papers on the table with the deliberate quiet of a man who knows the weight of documents and uses them accordingly. He was 60 years old, gray-haired, dressed with the particular respectability of a man whose profession required him to appear more trustworthy than he sometimes was. He explained, in careful, measured sentences, that the £400 remained outstanding, that the estate had no assets with which to service it, that Gerald's credit was compromised, and that the path forward was narrow. There are two accounts at issue, he said. The larger pertains to a loan your father contracted in 1811. The smaller pertains to a property conveyance your father witnessed in the same year. If you would sign as a confirming witness to the conveyance record, I am authorized to reduce the principal by £160. Eliza sat across the table with her hands folded and looked at the document he had placed before her. She read it completely, twice. Then she looked up. The conveyance record names a transaction on a date when my father was in Bath, she said. I know because I accompanied him. He cannot have witnessed what this document states he witnessed. Mr. Sims's expression did not change. Memory is sometimes imprecise in matters of this kind. My memory is precise, she said. I kept a journal that year. The dates are recorded. My father was not in London on the 15th of October in 1811, and I will not sign a document attesting that he was. She pushed the papers back across the table. Sims did not take them immediately. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that she recognized as a calculation running behind a neutral surface. The remaining debt, he said, will fall due at Michaelmas. Your brother has no means to service it. I understand that, she said. I will not sign the document. He gathered the papers. He rose, bowed, and left. Eliza sat in the parlor for a long time after he had gone, with the sound of the street coming through the window and her hands still folded in her lap. She was not certain she had done the right thing for Gerald. She was certain she had done the right thing. And the two were not always the same. And the difference between them was a kind of grief she had carried for 9 months, and had not yet found a place to put down. She did not know that James Cavendish, Duke of Ashford, had been standing in the corridor outside the parlor door. He had come to speak with Sims directly. He had arrived at the house a quarter hour after Sims, having received word that morning from Holt that the Sims firm had been involved in property conveyance irregularities he had some interest in pursuing. He had heard the landlady direct Sims to the parlor. He had reached the parlor door and stopped, because a woman's voice was already speaking. And she was speaking with the careful precision of someone who had read every word before her and understood each one. He stood in the corridor, and he listened to Eliza Hartley refuse the document. He listened to her name the date and her father's absence and her journal. He listened to her push the papers back across the table. He heard her say, with a steadiness that he had not heard in a very long time, that she would not sign. He stood there for a moment after Sims left, the corridor quiet around him, and something moved behind his composed face that he would not have named if asked. He pressed one hand briefly against the doorframe, and then straightened, and walked back the way he had come. He came from a grief that had not loosened its structure in 3 years. His daughter, Charlotte, had died in the winter of 1811, 3 years old, of a lung illness that had taken her between one morning and the next with a speed that no preparation could have answered. He had been at Ashford Hall. He had been in the room. He had held her small hand through the night, and she had been gone by morning. And afterward, he had stood in the nursery alone and looked at the portrait the painter had finished the previous summer. The one where Charlotte sat in the garden chair with her dark hair loose, and he had turned it to face the wall. Not because he could not bear to see it, but because he could. And because the bearing of it was a weight he had decided to carry inward rather than outward, since the outward carrying had broken things he had not known could break. He had come to London for the season because Dorothea required it, and because the estate required it, and because there were legal matters that required his presence. He had not come for anything else. He had not expected to stand in a corridor in Marylebone and hear someone refuse to falsify a document, and he had not expected the hearing of it to produce in him the specific sensation of a window opening in a closed room. The following morning he spoke to Holt about the Sims firm's property conveyances. The morning after that, he sent Holt to confirm 3 dates in the Bath register. The morning after that, he did nothing, because he was not yet certain what he intended to do, only that he intended something. And that intention had a shape he recognized and did not entirely trust. At the Pembroke dinner the following Thursday, Lady Dorothea seated Cecily Vane at Ashford's right hand. The dinner was 12 covers, held in the state dining room at Pembroke House, and Dorothea had arranged it with the precision of a military campaign. Cecily wore pale gold, which suited her. She spoke pleasantly and at appropriate length, and laughed at the correct moments, and Dorothea watched from the foot of the table with the quiet confidence of a woman who has set a scene and trusts it to perform. Eliza had been invited as a small consideration to Miss Porter, whose mother was a distant connection of the Pembroke family. She sat at the lower end of the table, beside an elderly colonel who had seen Waterloo in the distance, and talked about it for 30 minutes, without pause. She ate her soup and listened to the colonel, and did not look toward the upper end of the table more than 3 times, which she considered a reasonable discipline. After the dessert course was cleared and the ladies withdrew, Dorothea settled into the drawing room with the authority of someone who has prepared a speech and found the correct moment for it. "Cecily will do very well for Ashford," she said, addressing the room generally and no one specifically in a way that addressed Eliza specifically. "He has been too long without a proper establishment. The girl has everything required: a good family, a settled income, a sensible temperament." She opened her fan and regarded its painted panels. Some young women come to the season without any of these advantages, which is, of course, their misfortune. But it does not do to mistake presence for possibility. The room received this in the way that drawing rooms receive such statements, with a small collective adjustment, a slight realignment of postures. Eliza held her teacup with both hands. She did not look up. Miss Porter, at her elbow, made a very small sound that was not quite speech. "Poor thing," said Mrs. Greville, one of Dorothea's intimates, in a voice that was not designed to carry but did, the way such voices always do in such rooms. "She has nothing, really. A dead father and a brother with debts, and a gown that has been turned twice at minimum. An encumbrance on the season, nothing more." The teacup was warm. Eliza felt its warmth against her palms and focused on that specific sensation, and did not permit herself any other expression. She left the drawing room when it was correct to leave the drawing room. She found the terrace door and stepped through it. The night was cold for May. The sky a dark, clear blue. The garden below the terrace a mass of shadows, and the faint white shapes of clematis on the wall. She stood at the stone balustrade and breathed, once, carefully. She had known, in some part of her understanding, that this was how the season would resolve. She was not Cecily Vane. She was not positioned for any of the things the season was designed to produce. She was 22 years old, with a retrimmed gown and a dead father, and a brother who owed £400 and who needed her, specifically her clear and steady thinking, to survive the autumn. She had come to London for Gerald, not for herself, and the season had done exactly what she had expected it to do. She had not expected the hand in the white glove. She had not expected to stand in a corridor and hear her own voice refusing a document while someone listened from the other side of the door. She had not expected the sensation, small and unwelcome, of being seen. The terrace door opened behind her. She did not turn. Miss Hartley. She turned then. It was not Dorothea. It was not Cecily. It was Holt, the secretary. And he looked uncomfortable in the way that men look uncomfortable when they have been asked to deliver a message they were not designed to deliver. "Lady Pembroke requests that you return inside," he said. And then he stopped. And she understood without further instruction that the request was not a request. She went inside. Not because she was afraid. Not because Dorothea's authority was absolute. But because the terrace was cold, and Gerald was in Marylebone, and she had something to tell him that she had been avoiding for 3 days, and the avoidance was its own kind of damage. She gathered her things. She thanked Miss Porter. She walked to the front of the house, and waited in the cold vestibule for a hackney to be called. No one came to find her. No one said goodbye. The footman at the door held it open with the polished indifference of a man who opened this door for whomever arrived and let pass whomever departed, and she stepped out into the May night and did not look back at the lit windows of Pembroke House. She told Gerald that evening. He was sitting at the window of the Marylebone room with a book he had not been reading, and she sat across from him and told him about the Sims document and the debt and Michaelmas and the journal she had kept in 1811 that placed their father in Bath on the 15th of October, and nowhere else. She told him everything she had known for 9 months and withheld for his protection, and she watched his face while she told it, and she did not soften a single fact. Gerald was 19 years old, and he had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubbornness, and he sat very still through the telling of it. When she finished, he said, "You refused to sign." "Yes," she said. "For 9 months you have been managing this alone." "I have been managing it carefully," she said. "There is a difference." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Eliza, I need you to tell me what to do." She told him, "Find employment. Not the work of a gentleman of leisure, but actual employment, in a house that needed a secretary or an estate that needed a manager, because he was genuinely clever, and clerks were wanted everywhere, and shame was a luxury they could not currently afford. Write to their mother's cousin in Northumberland, who had a working estate and had offered, 3 years ago, to take on a capable young man. Send the letter tonight." Gerald wrote the letter. She sealed it and took it down to the landlady's boy and paid him 3 pennies to carry it to the post. Then she sat on the edge of her narrow bed and looked at the wall and understood, with a finality that felt more like relief than grief, that the season was over for her. She had done what she came to do. What happened next was not within her management. What she did not know, at that moment, was that it was already happening. The Vane Assembly was held on the following Friday at a subscription rooms in Hanover Square, and it was the last significant event of the season's first month. Lady Dorothea attended with Cecily. Miss Porter attended with her mother. The Duke of Ashford attended alone, arriving 20 minutes after the doors opened, and standing for a long moment in the doorway, with an expression that Holt, hovering at his elbow, had learned not to interpret. Eliza attended because Miss Porter had asked her very specifically, and because she had one more evening before the question of the season closed entirely, and because she had decided, in the clear, cold air of the morning after the terrace, that she would not spend it hiding in Marylebone. She wore the blue gown. She had not retrimmed it. She had simply pressed it again, and pinned her hair herself, and worn her mother's pearl earrings, which were her own and real, and walked into the Hanover Square rooms as she had walked into every room this season, which was to say quietly and with her spine straight and her face arranged in the expression of a woman who knew her own quality even when the room around her had collectively decided not to. The orchestra was playing when she arrived. The floor was full. She found Miss Porter near the east wall, which had become, she reflected briefly, something of a station for her, and she stood with Miss Porter and held no program because there were no programs at a subscription assembly, and she was glad of it. She did not see Ashford come in. She became aware of him the way one becomes aware of a change in air pressure, a slight settling of the room's attention. And when she looked toward the door, he was already inside, already scanning, already still in that particular way he had of standing. His gaze found her. She looked away first. She looked at the dancers on the floor, at the candles, at the far wall, at Miss Porter's profile. She looked at everything except the man standing near the doorway who had not moved. Lady Dorothea appeared at the edge of her vision, moving toward Ashford with the smooth efficiency of someone who has identified a necessary interception. She reached him. She spoke to him. She gestured toward the upper end of the room, where Cecily Vane stood beside a pillar in white silk with a gardenia in her hair, positioned like an argument he was supposed to find conclusive. Eliza watched this happen with the careful equanimity of someone who had already accepted the verdict. She felt something in her chest that she would not name, because naming it would only confirm how wrong she had been to let the pebbles accumulate at all. Then Ashford looked at Dorothea. He said something, one short sentence, and turned. He crossed the ballroom. Later, Eliza would not be able to say with precision how long the crossing took, because the room did something she had never seen a room do before. It quieted. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in widening rings, the way water stills around a stone that has been dropped into its center. Heads turned. Conversations paused. The orchestra continued because the orchestra had not been told to stop. But the talking and the laughing and the particular layered noise of 200 people at an assembly all drew back and left a peculiar silence in the space where Ashford walked. He walked toward the east wall. He walked toward Eliza Hartley. She stood very still. Her heart was doing the thing she had told it not to do, which was to move to her throat and become audible. She pressed her hands together at her waist and waited, and he covered the distance in 3 strides and stopped in front of her, and looked at her the way he had looked at her the first night, except that this time there was nothing in his face that could be read as cold. He had let something go, some degree of the sustained containment. And beneath it was a steady, clear attention that looked like what it was. "Miss Hartley," he said. "Your Grace," she said. "I am told," he said, "that you were invited to leave Pembroke House." She felt color rise to her face. "I was not precisely invited to remain." "No," he said. He looked at her very steadily. "I wish to correct that impression." The room around them was entirely still. He said, "I have spoken with my solicitor regarding the Sims firm's accounts." He said it quietly, for her, not for the room, but the room heard it. "The conveyance records have been corrected. Your brother's debt to that firm has been discharged." She stared at him. The £400. Michaelmas. The Northumberland letter that Gerald had already sent. That was already in the post. That could not now be recalled. She did not know what to do with what he had just told her. She knew only that her hands were cold, and her face was warm, and the room was absolutely silent. "I do not understand," she said, quietly, honestly. "Why would you do that?" He was still for a moment. Then he said, "I heard you." 3 words. She heard them land the way words do, when they have been chosen with the specific gravity of things that cannot be taken back once said. "I was in that corridor," he said. "I heard you refuse the document. I heard you name the date. I heard you say you kept a journal." He paused. And in the pause she could see, for the first time, the thing behind the contained face. The thing she had glimpsed in the angle of his jaw and the specific quality of his stillness. It was not coldness. It had never been coldness. It was the careful bearing of a man who had lost something irreplaceable and had organized himself entirely around not losing anything else. "You were protecting your brother at cost to yourself. That is not a small thing." She heard someone near the edge of the crowd draw in a breath. She did not look toward it. She kept her eyes on his face, because she was afraid that if she looked away, the room would rearrange itself into something she understood better, and she did not want it to. "I should like," he said, "to ask your permission for a country dance, if there is one remaining this evening. And after that, if you are willing, I would ask permission to speak with you further. Not here. Not tonight." He paused again. "I am not practiced at this. I want to be clear about that." "No," she said, and then caught herself. I do not mean no to the dance. I mean that you are, I think, rather clearer than you believe yourself to be." Something crossed his face. It was not a smile, or not quite, but it was in the neighborhood of a smile, and she understood from Miss Porter's sharp intake of breath at her elbow that this was an unusual thing to witness. "The dance," he said. "Yes," she said. He offered his hand. She placed her hand on it and felt the specific warmth of his glove against her own ungloved fingers, and the contact of it ran from her wrist to her shoulder in a way she had no vocabulary for except the precise physical truth of it. Lady Dorothea stood at the head of the room with her fan still, and her face arranged in an expression that was attempting composure and not entirely succeeding. She had spent 40 years organizing the world along lines she understood. And the world had just turned sideways in a subscription room in Hanover Square, and she was old enough and honest enough in the private space of her own chest to recognize the quality of what she was witnessing, even if it disrupted everything she had planned. Miss Cecily Vane, standing beside the pillar with the gardenia in her hair, watched the Duke of Ashford lead Eliza Hartley onto the floor, and understood, with the practical clarity of a sensible young woman who had been told her entire life she was the correct choice, that there was a different kind of correctness operating in this room tonight, and that she was not, in this particular instance, it. The recognition was not comfortable, It was honest. She would manage it. The dance was a country dance in 6 figures, and Eliza danced it badly at first, and then less badly, because she had not danced in 3 weeks, and her feet remembered the steps slightly after the rest of her did. Ashford was patient in the figures. He did not comment on the timing. He handed her across the set with a steadiness that was the same quality she had seen in his standing. That settled precision, and she was beginning to understand that it was not coldness at all, and had never been, but had been doing the work of coldness because he had required something to do that work in the years since Charlotte. He had not said Charlotte's name to her. She did not yet know it. She would learn it later, by the fire at Ashford Hall, in the weeks after the season closed, when he showed her the portrait that had spent 3 years facing the wall. The portrait was small, the frame a dark walnut, and the painter had caught something true about the child's face, a quality of attention in the dark eyes that she recognized from the father's face, the same steady, careful regard turned outward on a garden rather than inward on a grief. Ashford carried the portrait to the mantelpiece himself, on a morning in late November, when the snow had been falling since the previous evening, and the grounds of the estate were white to the tree line, and he set it in the center of the shelf above the fire and stood back and looked at it. Eliza stood beside him. She did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that would not be less than the moment. She was aware of his stillness, the familiar settled quality of it, and aware that it had changed in the months since Hanover Square. Not disappeared, but softened, the way stone softens when water has worked against it for long enough. The containment was still there. It had simply admitted, by degrees, that it did not have to do all the work alone. Mr. Sims had been quietly removed from the management of the Hartley account by the end of May. Holt had presented the corrected bath records to the appropriate authority, and the property conveyance at issue had been examined and found deficient in the ways Eliza's testimony had predicted. Gerald's debt of £400 had been cleared against the improperly levied interest, and Gerald himself had received a letter from Northumberland that arrived the day after his own, his mother's cousin having acted with unusual speed on a matter he had been hoping to resolve for some time. Gerald was not in London for the autumn. He was learning the management of a working estate 200 miles north, and writing to Eliza twice a week in a hand that grew steadier as the months passed. The wedding at Ashford had been a quiet thing, by the Duke's preference and Eliza's own. 12 guests at the parish church on a morning in October when the oak trees along the drive had turned to copper and gold. Dorothea had attended. She had dressed carefully and conducted herself with a dignified correctness that had cost her something, and was the better for it. And when she took Eliza's hand afterward in the church porch, she had said, very quietly, "He has been alone too long," which was as close as she would come to saying that she had been wrong, and was enough. Cecily had not attended. She was in Bath with her mother. They would hear, in the following spring, that she had accepted an offer from a solicitor's son in Wiltshire who apparently suited her very well, and Eliza would feel, on hearing it, nothing except a small honest warmth on the young woman's behalf. Now it was November. The snow had been falling since the previous evening. The fire in the library at Ashford Hall had been burning since morning, and the portrait on the mantelpiece caught the firelight in its walnut frame, and the dark-eyed child in the garden chair looked out at the room with the particular attention that was her father's in miniature. Ashford sat in the chair to the left of the fire with a book he had been reading for the past hour. Eliza sat across from him with her mother's pearl earrings on and a cup of tea cooling on the table beside her, and a letter from Gerald in her hand, which she had now read twice, and which reported that the first lambing count of the season had gone better than expected, and that the estate manager had called him a quick study, which Gerald had recorded with poorly concealed satisfaction. She looked up. Ashford had not been reading for the past several minutes. He had been watching her read. "Gerald is well," she said. "Good," he said. Outside, the snow was thickening, falling straight and slow in the windless air, covering the gravel drive and the lawns and the copper oaks in white, and the house around them was warm and lit and full of the specific quiet that settles over a place when it has found, after a long absence, the person it was waiting for. She folded Gerald's letter and set it on the table beside the cooling tea, and looked at the portrait on the mantelpiece, and then at the man in the chair across from her. He was still looking at her with that same steady, clear attention, the one that had stood at the center of the Hanover Square Assembly and crossed the floor toward her while the room went quiet. The one that had been in his face from the beginning, she thought. If she had been able to read it then. She had not been able to read it then. She could read it now. The fire crackled once and settled. The snow fell in the dark outside the tall windows. Charlotte looked out from the mantelpiece at the warm room, at the two people by the fire, at the home that was being made around her small painted presence, and the candle on the writing table burned steadily on, and did not go out. If this story moved you, leave a word in the comments below. There are more of these waiting to be told, and knowing you are here is what calls them into being.